Okay, cool. We are working through the history of how we came to have forest and outdoor recreation as sort of a dedicated profession with its own ethics, its own professional practices, how we have specialized the idea of land management from like 16, 17, 1800s into forestry as a division of land management, and then further specified park and wildland management as a sort of entire field within forestry. And where we left off last week was somewhere kind of around the 1920s, 1930s mark in American history. So right about a century ago. Remember, in 1916, we've created the United States National Park Service, thanks to a guy named Stephen Tyng Mather. This guy here, a borax mining guy who wrote an angry letter to Congress saying, we're doing a terrible job running our national parks, and Congress writes him back and says, all right, you do better. And so he does. He pays for the first 3 years of United States National Park Service as an agency or as a branch of the federal government, pays out of pocket. The Rangers, buys their uniforms, pays for pretty much everything until Congress gets its act together around 1920 to figure things out and actually fund the mandate that they had created by law back in 1916. And that takes us through a sort of seminal moment in the history of parks, right? So the decisions this guy and his colleagues, he brings in a bunch of really smart people, really enterprising people, and says, hey, I can't do this myself, and some of you guys are smarter than me. Let's do something the world has never seen before. And let's do it with real excellence, real professionalism. Let's figure this out, right? Congress has given us a mandate to figure this stuff out on behalf of the people of the United States of America. So we're not going to go the direction that all the monarchies, all the kingdoms and empires of the past have gone. We're taking this in a new way, and that's going to require us to invent some things and to figure some things out and to hammer out some things that might look pretty different if we just leave them as assumptions. Okay? So a lot of the work in this time is making explicit things that people kind of think might be a good idea or a possibility and so forth, right? This is a matter of single-digit years after John Muir, Gifford Pinchot, and Teddy Roosevelt have tried to figure out sort of one generation back with respect to figuring things out, conservation and preservation, right? We have to invent those terms. So this is Roosevelt. This is his post-Rough Rider shooting at people and getting shot days. Here's Roosevelt at Yosemite. So now we're back in the 1901 to 1909 time period. So moving backwards a little bit before we move forward. And this is a time when presidents on both sides of the political spectrum. Now, granted, this has been about 100 years since this guy has been president. And our political parties have drifted somewhat from what they looked like in 1906, say, when this guy was granted the powers of the Antiquities Act to create national monuments. But back then, and into the 70s, 80s, and 90s, national parks were not, preservation was not any kind of divisive political issue the way it kind of is now. So presidents on both sides of the spectrum, at both ends of the spectrum, are wanting to be associated with, in strong support of, and in fact pointing to their involvement with, their service at national parks as specific criteria on why we should elect them, right? So Teddy Roosevelt created a bunch of national parks and supported their creation. Warren G. Harding at Yellowstone National Park before him, right? So, or right after him. This is like 1910 to 1915 era. Let's see. Who else we got? A little bit later, we'll see like Gerald R. Ford as a park ranger. Look at that face, right? So this is cast to the American people as, hey, this is a new thing that we as a country are doing that nobody else has thought to do, nobody else can do. Anywhere in the world, anywhere in human history, this is a new thing. And it's cast as sort of so admirable and noble that a president is going to point to this on the resume and say, vote for me, because I'm in line with this, and this is for all of us. I am for all of you, elect me, etc. Right? So, Gerald Ford, we saw this last class session. Herbert Hoover at Rapidan Camp. This is one part of Shenandoah National Park today. Let's see. Nope, that was relevant again. Never mind. So this takes us through the 1910s and 1920s. In the 1920s, of course, the Roaring '20s, we have Prohibition going, we have Capone the gangster up in Chicago and down in Marion, Illinois, selling bootleg alcohol and cheating on his taxes, and Elliot Ness coming after him, and so forth. And this is a time period where there's a huge sense of this groundswell movement. Like, these national parks are for everybody, and anybody who's anybody, economically, politically, whatever, they want to be seen as associated with this. So we have these gentlemen's dinners where powerful people are getting together to hammer out, how do we do national parks? How do we do national forests, and so forth? And then in 1929, we have Black Friday, the not so much get a flat screen TV for cheaper, but like the actual Black Friday that throws the entire world into economic depression and puts a whole lot of people out of work, right? So unemployment looking pretty bad at that time. And as a result of this, immediately after the creation of a whole bunch of these sort of first-generation national parks and national forests, soon to be wildlife refuges and so forth, in the 1920s, immediately now, America has to look to these parks, forests, other protected areas as not just a pleasuring ground of the 1920s where we can go for a nice walk, where we can stimulate our exercise and be a little bit more healthy. It was kind of the attitude in the 1920s, the Roaring '20s. To, holy cow, I haven't had work in a couple of years, and me and a whole bunch of other people are going to starve if we don't figure something out. And so we have a whole lot of records of people moving into national parks and living out of their cars, and fishing out of national parks, hunting out of national parks, not in the sense of like recreational white-tailed deer hunting like, we do on a weekend or two a year these days, but like, man, I gotta fish to catch tonight's dinner for myself and for my family. This is a time before we have the birth control, the healthcare choices that a lot of people have today, right? We're not there yet in terms of modern medicine, or even like electrically tested condoms by Durex or whatever. So families are large and a lot of mouths to feed. So we have an era, really almost about 15 years, of the economy just kind of grinding to a halt, okay? Tens of millions of people out of work. And at this point, we have the federal government stepping in to do some pretty important, even life-saving things. So creating a civilian conservation corps, which got a whole bunch of forestry and land management and first wave construction on a lot of these new parks done. Hundreds of thousands of young able-bodied men put into essentially work camps. So they all arrive, they build the cabins and tool sheds and so forth that they're all going to be in for a period of months or a couple of years. at these national parks in rural southern Illinois, where the Dust Bowl, which is happening around this time of the Great Depression, is absolutely ruining farmland, where non-regenerative farming, non-conservation-oriented farming practices here in the soft soils of southern Illinois, like Peoria, Luss, are just devastating the landscape's fertility and ability to feed Americans. So we have the Civilian Conservation Corps. And 90% of the paycheck that you earned by carving out trails, by dynamiting new trails and roads and so forth in places like what will later become Shawnee National Forest, what is currently a national park like Yellowstone or Yosemite, we have lots of these people living and working in these places now, entirely just straight up supported by federal programs and sending 90% of your paycheck home to your family so that you don't starve in the work camp and they don't starve back home, right? We've never had anything quite like that since, and we had never seen anything like that before. And this is kind of a proactive social response at the time to figure out how do we avoid becoming the next Irish potato famine, where millions of Irish people just flat out starve to death because of a potato blight, and how the British government was managing or mismanaging food production for Irish people and so forth. Okay, so we have a whole bunch of photos to kind of illustrate what life was like for regular people. In this time, the John D. Rockefellers we were talking about last week, in this time the Rockefellers are doing fine. It's not that everybody is starving, it's that almost everybody is struggling, or a large minority of people are on the brink of starvation. So, this is a sequence of photos from, I believe, Time magazine that was very famous. So this woman, I believe, if I've got my facts right, this lady's in her late 20s, okay? And this is what she has to go on to support herself and her family. We don't have modern healthcare practices. We don't even have most of our modern food preservation techniques. We've got canning, and not freeze drying, and not preservatives like sodium EDTA, right? There are people living in 3-sided lean-tos all over the country. And we've got 15 years of hard winters to get through to survive, okay? So national parks take on the role of human survival habitat. A lot of people living out of their cars were in lean-tos like this on public land because they have nowhere else to go. There are no jobs for them to have a house and just sort of have enough to exist otherwise. Okay? And so we have the Civilian Conservation Corps. We have the Works Progress Administration, which is a little bit like the Civilian Conservation Corps, but maybe a little bit more focused on some large government projects and so forth. So we have things like the Tennessee Valley Authority is a third 3-letter agency created during this time. The Tennessee Valley Authority's approach is to not worry so much about people potentially starving to death all across the American landscape, but specifically, let's get rural electrification to places like Appalachia, so the Tennessee Valley, Tennessee River, for example. We have a whole bunch of hydropower projects like the damming up the Gully River, the Youghiogheny out east, and a whole bunch of other spots where just it's economically prohibitive to put in coal-fired power plants there or other forms of electrification, and we got to have power generation up in the mountains here for these people who are living up in the mountains, and it's a very, very hard scrabble life, right? And in some respects, it still is today. But the Tennessee Valley Authority, those are huge construction projects. This is the era in which, like, we're getting the Hoover Dam and the Glen Canyon Dam and all these dams out east with the Tennessee Valley Authority. right? That's employing thousands of people to pour these millions of cubic yards of concrete in these places just to generate power for folks, just to help people survive through the winter in places where there's stuff like electric heat needed. Make sense? So, whether or not your personal sense of how to do government works better with a very small government or a very big government, the solution at this time was to go super big government and just throw money at a federal level out to folks just to keep people from starving. And then we get into World War II. In Europe, we have Weimar Germany in the 1930s, and Hitler and his brown coats and so forth, capitalizing on the economic and social uncertainties of the German and Austrian people following World War I. So World War I happened back in the 19-teens over there. And World War II really pulled the United States out of the Depression, right? So the United States is kind of sitting on the sidelines, and in the 20s and 30s, as Hitler is getting started and moving to power, politicians' answer to Hitler at the time was so-called appeasement, where it's like, all right, this guy is kind of scary, but let's not piss him off, so we'll just kind of let Hitler do his thing. And this is weird and unfamiliar to us and kind of gross, but let's not stir the hornet's nest or something like that. And that allows Hitler to put together the Wehrmacht, the German war machine. So in the late 1930s, Hitler starts invading other folks and taking his deal beyond his own borders and killing a lot of people for the sake of power, I guess. So in the United States, we're wrestling with the Great Depression. So is everybody else. But the United States is not immediately having to start fighting battles in 1939 when the Germans really start mobilizing and using blitzkrieg tactics to just blast into other countries, puncture the defensive capabilities of those countries, and then move on to the next with so-called lightning speed. We get pulled into World War II in the 1940s, and while Europe has already mostly been devastated economically, industrially, socially by the spread of the Nazis, the Third Reich, we jump in and our factories, we're like, okay, this guy is not going to stand. We have a Lend-Lease program with Soviet Russia, or what will become Soviet Russia under Stalin, saying, hey, we're going to give you a whole bunch of tires and tanks and stuff like that, like Russians. We're going to manufacture a whole bunch of your war material and send it over basically for free, and you can pay us back later. And let's sort of puncture the Nazis' expansion from both sides. And that is pretty much what happens. So in 1945, well, we'll get there in a sec. In 1939 to 1943, when we get into the war in 42, this puts all of America to work. And importantly, this puts more than the people who had been working previously to work, right? So a lot of women, this is a Rosie the Riveter type image, a lot of people. We just need bodies to drive pneumatic drill guns and put together American bombers and tanks and manufacture all of the materiel that American warfighters are going to need, because we're about to go over there. And we're also going to need to jump into the war in the Pacific theater against Japan. So we're fighting a war, a global war on two fronts, and America is largely responsible for defeating the Japanese, which is a difficult thing. The Pacific is huge, and the Japanese are very intent on not getting bested And so it takes a bunch of really, really intense island hopping, so island to island fighting in the Pacific Theater, and trench and sort of slowly retaking Europe back from the Germans on the European front. And so this is America in that specific and strange window of we're fighting in a world war and we're fighting our way out of the Depression, and as it turns out, us not having to fight a war on our soil really puts us in a good position to use one to solve the other. We use war fighting in World War II to pull us out of the Depression, pull the rest of the world out of the Depression following World War II, and so forth. All right, so we're using a lot of steam power in this time, right? Big industrial efforts in places like the Glen Canyon Dam, which created a new national recreation area upstream of that dam, right? There's a whole bunch of boating in the middle of the desert out west. Anybody ever been to Lake Powell? It's gorgeous. It's like Grand Canyon walls to this lake, because Lake Powell is what was sort of upstream of an area called the Vermilion Cliffs, which is upstream of the Grand Canyon. So here's what the inside of one of those dams looks like, Hoover Dam. And Hoover Dam is one of those first industrial era projects that is big enough to be seen from space and stuff like that. Like, it is unthinkably enormous. It's so much concrete that if they hadn't run water piping through the concrete of Hoover Dam, it would have taken over 100 years for the chemical reaction of the concrete curing, or setting, or hardening up, for that process to work, right? So, cool down an exothermic reaction and it can continue faster. Like, imagine that. Imagine the foundation for your house being so big that it would take over 100 years for that chemical reaction to finish up. Just absolutely unbelievable stuff. So this is what recreation looked like for a bunch of folks in the late 1930s and early 1940s, right? School lunch program kind of a thing. And as through all history, little kids turning everyday objects, a broken piece of wood in this case, into imaginative play or emergent play, right? So how many of you guys have ever made a sword or a gun out of a stick? Yeah, that's a universal human experience, right? And this is what everybody has the resources to do, because we're all just trying to not starve to death right now. It's kind of the vibe in these photos, okay? So things like not recreational, but subsistence fishing with cane poles, right? Basically free to make, and you can feed your family with that, assuming you have access to the habitat. And we use the national park system, the national forest system, etc., to make sure that people have access to places to fish. It's not just about keeping the landowners alive, it's about keeping everybody alive, okay? So, wooden-soled shoes and big dam construction projects. This is still a period in which there is so little capital for people to buy houses that a lot of people are still making houses that look like, to us, log cabins. Okay. And World War II era food preservation techniques, canning, right? So this is Karo syrup, which is not a particularly fancy way to sweeten foods or to cook with, but it's calories, right? And it's calories that won't spoil in that can between a farmer's field and the market, somebody's pantry, and finally to the dinner table, right? Food spoilage is to this day a huge problem. We lose 30 to 40% of everything that we produce to food spoilage, which is absolutely unsustainable, and there's a bunch of awesome research going on, even in this college, right now to get that last X% of food spoilage taken care of. But it's never going to be a completely solved problem under our current regulatory structure. The way that people are thinking about and experiencing their natural world in this era looks a lot like this. This is the era of P.T. Barnum, Barnum and Bailey's circus, right? So we talked about how the very earliest part of the 20th century, the early 1900s, we have this spectacle idea. Things like firefall in Yosemite and firefall at Glacier National Park and so forth. And all these places where you have a big cliff, let's make a huge bonfire and then bulldoze it off the cliff every night or once a week, whatever. Right? So it's not enough to enjoy wildlife. We need to feed wildlife food trash and bring it into view of people. Or we need to put a tutu on a brown bear and train it to do circus acts. Okay? And of course, in the Great Depression, and even in World War II itself, horse-drawn carts are still the overwhelming majority form of transport. So World War II used, not just like had available, but actually used millions of horses drawing carts to do everything from get everybody in their Sunday best to church and back to hauling artillery shells to the front lines in Europe. Okay? So we have cars before this point, but not a lot of people able to buy cars in the middle of the Great Depression, just trying to stay alive. Okay? Now, throughout this time, there is some actually incredibly impressive advancement in forestry and wildlife management, right? So if you're a WAMCon student, this guy is one of your sort of patron saints, right? Aldo Leopold. Anybody know what he did? Anybody ever heard of Aldo Leopold? All right. So Aldo Leopold wrote a bunch of books based on his professional experiences. And Aldo Leopold is one of the guys of the first half of the 20th century to give us things for the first time as a people, important things that we rely on a lot today in forestry, things like a land ethic. So an ethic is a principled decision-making structure. It's a system, an objective algorithm or heuristic or system or way of making decisions that helps somebody to say, this particular way to take this decision is good, it's moral, it's ethical, right? Or this one is bad. And you may or may not agree with this conclusion, but at least this is a systematic way to evaluate our decision possibilities and arrive at this one could be pretty good, and this one might be not just bad, but even evil, right? That's what an ethic is. So a land ethic is a way of making decisions about land management. Decisions in forestry, big scale, small scale, short term, real long term stuff. A land ethic is a way to say this particular approach, this TSI plan that I wrote for my other class, this land ethic helps me decide this TSI plan is a good thing, like a morally good thing, not just like make somebody a bunch of money. That's part of it. But there are other aspects that go into a timber stand improvement plan or a recreation management plan or a trails development plan or what have you, a wildland fire management plan. There are a lot of things that go into it. And so a land ethic is one gift of Aldo Leopold to the American people and really the people of the world. And Aldo Leopold wrote in books like a San County Almanac, a thing is good, you can arrive at it as good and not evil if the process by which you get to putting in that land management idea that you got, if the process and the outcome lead to that land being more integral, more functional, less fragmented, etc., then you can say that that land management decision or plan is ethical. That's a big deal. Because we've had close to a century now, by the time he's writing this, of, well shoot, we can clear cut everything. We can mine everything with steam power now. We can shoot out all the wildlife, and we can make bank. We can get that bag, those stacks of cash, right? more money, less wildlife. So this is a pretty big deal. Aldo Leopold gives us a way of figuring out good and evil as foresters. Amazing stuff. And Aldo Leopold and his kin, a Starker Leopold, do things like help invent wildlife biology, conservation biology, right? They're putting in stuff like basic zoological and field sciences and marrying it with stuff like a land ethic to figure out how best do we reintroduce bison? How best do we provide some habitat for large predators, right? So these guys are involved in some research with wolves, which to this day, wolf management, large mobile carnivore management is tricky. A lot of people don't like wolves. A lot of ranchers will shoot wolves on site, legal or not, because they are that concerned about the health of their herds. These guys are some of the first to start doing the actual science to figure out, look, if we hunt out all the wolves, what happens to our prey species like deer? Anybody?
Explode.
Deer populations explode and then crash and explode and crash. And while we're in the population explosion phase of deer, we have a lot of vehicle crashes, which cause those vehicles to explode, and like humans die, right? So these guys are able to start pulling together in some, really even just a couple of kind of broad survey, or in the industry we call these roundup reports of doing the field science and then collecting all the studies of that type and saying, look, it's not just this one study saying it, there's this sort of consensus across all of this early wildlife management research, all this field zoology research, that you have the capability, you have the technology, we have the firearms to hunt or trap all of these large predators and mesocarnivores like coyotes out of existence. We can do it. But what is right? What is ethical? These ecosystems work better when we have meso and large carnivores in place and in enough population and with intact migratory capability across things like barbed wire to help keep prey populations in check. So even if you don't like them, put up with some wolves so that you don't have to put up with way too many deer. So this is a big deal. Now this is not, Aldo Leopold isn't in like the forefront of the American mind, but for those of us in the industry, this guy's a giant, right? Aldo Leopold and A. Starker Leopold, pretty big deal. So these guys are super important in that regard. All right, let's flip over to the post-war America lecture and get through that one. Let's see here. Bam. Ooh, ah, back again, as the song goes. So, in 1945, we conclude the war on Nazis, and we won. Nice. Let's recontextualize to forest and outdoor recreation management. Okay? So, in 1945, the war is over. We have a whole bunch of young men, an entire generation of American men coming back from the European theater, coming back from the Pacific theater of war, and getting back to their wives or their girlfriends, whatever, and everybody is making whoopee, right? So from 1945 to almost 1965, an almost 20-year period, we have the creation of the baby boomer generation, right? All these doughboy fresh guys coming back from the war, make babies, and the United States is not invaded and firebombed to hell like Dresden, Germany. like most of the entirely stick-built wooden cities in mainland and island Japan, right? We never got invaded. The closest we got to that was the attack on Pearl Harbor, which blew up some, not very many, but plenty of Navy ships. That's the worst we suffered domestically for the war, right? A lot of American men, killed warfighting and so forth. But our factories are still going gangbusters. So the American economy immediately post-World War II is white hot. And the American population starts to go up into orbit. And correspondingly, in the graph, this is a decade-on-decade total tabulation of how many people or how many visitor days people are going to national parks. Now, the specific numbers don't matter, so I've only put 0 to 285 million. We've since added about 100 million recreation visits in the 2020s, so this graph would be up another 100 million from there if we had the 2020s at the end of this. What I want you to see is the change between each of these columns on this column chart, right? So in 1940, we got about this much. In 1950, we got about twice as much as that. And then in 1960, we got about twice as much as that. And then in the 1970s, we got about twice as much as that. And things only start to decelerate. It's still growing, but it's decelerating, right? So the graph is starting to curve back towards horizontal. We only get that in the 1980s, right? So from 1940 to 1989, we have a doubling of recreation visits every 10 years. That's exponential growth, right? So for those of you who enjoyed your biology class and you are thinking about things like deer overpopulation, population doubling every X years is exponential growth. And that is what leads to population overloads and crashes, that feast or famine dynamic, that wild oscillation in deer populations in the absence of predators. So if you're the National Park Service in the 1920s and 1930s, just kind of getting your act together, where like national park visitation in 1920 doesn't even show up on this graph. It's like rounding error relative to 1980, okay? We're in the couple of 100 million visits by the 1980s. So this leads to a lot of growing pains. This is called the golden era of recreation because the baby boomers, if they were born, let's say 1946, by 1966, the middle of the 60s, the baby boomers are your age. And the economy is white hot. This is the period in American history where we're still climbing up oil production peaks, right? So there is very, very cheap energy. For every calorie of work that we put into sucking oil out of the ground and burning it to fuel the American economy, for every calorie we put in, we get about 115 calories of work out. So imagine if you're saving for retirement and you put away $100. If your retirement savings with $100 in there was growing at the rate we were getting energy out of oil and gas, coal and so forth, for every $100 you put in, you get over 10,000 out, right? That's crazy, right? If you want to make Rockefeller money, you're investing in this period, or you're alive in this period, okay? So that is the context in which folks now have cars. Cars are cheap, right? We had to make millions of Jeeps, tens of thousands of tanks, and we turned those wartime industrial capacities into commercial capacities. So everybody can get a car really pretty cheap. And President Eisenhower, who was president shortly after World War II, General Eisenhower during World War II, he puts together something called the Eisenhower Interstate System. So instead of Highway 13 being kind of the new hotness in southern Illinois to connect up all these small communities from Murfreesboro to Marion and so forth. Now we have interstates, limited access, high-speed travel, and now a lot more people who have a lot more cars can go a lot further, a lot faster, and visit a lot more national parks. So things are exploding. And it's not until this period, that is specifically the year 1950, where the National Park Service brings in more money in terms of like entrance fees. So pay $3 at this time to get into Yosemite National Park for a week. Pretty good deal. It's not until this time that the Park Service takes in more money with those entrance fees than the federal government has to send into the parks to pay all those rangers, to put in roads at parks, to maintain access for concessionaires to run things like all these lodges and so forth. All right? So the economy's white hot. Forest and outdoor recreation is white hot at this point. Logging, white hot because we got to build all these houses. Everybody wants that American dream in the 1950s of the single family detached home, right? Not a huge apartment building. Everybody wants their own house with that wooden picket fence, right? And so on and so forth. Okay? So this is the time period in which you can work one summer job and pay for 4 years of college with it. That is not the case now, right? The premise of our economy is fundamentally changed, unfortunately. And that's bad news for you and me. But back then, right, money was cheap. College was cheap. Forest and outdoor recreation, super cheap. And all of the technological innovations that we had to figure out to keep our warfighters safe and fed and fighting wars, right? All of those things translate pretty directly to forest and outdoor recreation. So in this era, we have a whole lot of people going to your local national park or your local national forest and using Army surplus gear to do it. Those big old heavy Alice packs. So Matthew, you might have ever seen one of those super old external frame packs. Those are designed to hold about 80 pounds of gear, beams, bandages, and bullets. And, well, we don't have a whole bunch of carbon fiber stuff yet. It's going to be space age technology coming up here in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But at least we got Army cots and pup tents, and that stuff works as well in Yosemite National Park as it does in France, getting shot at by German artillery. Okay, cool. So in this time, we have, this was a video, now it's broken. We have rapid social change as our capacity to think about change, to look for anything better than just trying to survive through the Great Depression. Now we have excess wealth, we have surplus capacity, we have surplus energy. And so this leads to a whole bunch of social change, and for folks of a certain perspective, social improvements. So the 1950s and 60s, this is the civil rights era. It's not until this time and later that most everybody is able to vote, something we kind of take for granted these days. And 20 million fewer people voted in 2024 than in 2020, right? So we are kind of taking it for granted. But we have things like efforts towards racial equity. We have things like a lot of these women who powered the factories, built the bombers, built the tanks and so forth, got out of the house. Well, they decide they kind of like that. And so we have a whole bunch of additional people able to show up in the work environment. And this leads to a lot more wealth. It leads to potentially a lot more folks able to engage in leisure, to afford that house and a trip. So this is the time period in which the family vacation becomes an annual thing. So if your parents ever, during summer vacation when you were in elementary school, packed you into their station wagon or SUV, crossover, and made everybody sleep in the same tent, and your parents kept you awake all night because they snore a lot, because they're away from their CPAP machines or whatever, right? This is when that got started. All right, all these things coming together at this time. In 1960, we get a crucial forest system bit of legislation called the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act. And you guys have heard of this one, right? This is a big one. Hopefully you have heard of this one, right? So this is where timber range recreation for the purposes of this class, watershed management, and fish and wildlife habitat management, conservation. This is when that gets encoded as Forest Service, this is your mission. You got to check these boxes. You got to check all of these boxes, right? So the United States Forest Service, again, to this day, handles almost as many hundreds of millions of visitor days of recreation as the United States National Park Service does. Also in this time, a lady researcher, which would not have been possible before this time socially in the United States, a gal named Rachel Carson writes an incredibly powerful and influential book called Silent Spring. And Rachel Carson is the first person to help the American public understand through easily digestible writing that translated a whole bunch of biology and human physiology and pesticides research into something that a random guy or gal off the street anywhere in America could understand. Hey, these pesticides are stopping a bunch of food losses and spoilages, but they're too effective. We're more powerful than we are ethical in the use of pesticides and herbicides. And it's sickening and killing our children. So we can have shiny apples without any worms in them, or we can have our children alive. America, we need to come to grips with this, is the central message of this book, Silent Spring. If you're curious about this from a social change perspective, from a forestry perspective, I have 2 first edition copies of the book Silent Spring in my office. You're welcome to stop by during office hours and check that out. It's a beautifully written book. And it helped folks understand, wow, our power is greater than our ethical ability to wield that power. That's a problem, right? This is also in the 1960s when we're getting into the nuclear arms race with now Soviet Russia, okay? And building progressively larger and larger bombs up into the megaton range and then into the gigaton range theoretically, right? So millions of tons of dynamite energy equivalent in a single atomic weapon. And we're going to get into the dozens of tens of thousands of nuclear warheads all across the world, starting in this period right now. In the middle of that decade, we get the Wilderness Preservation System. So in 1964, and if you're curious about wilderness management, take wilderness management with me in the spring. And we'll end on this today. So in 1964, Congress orders the United States Forest Service and the Park Service and Fish and Wildlife and everybody to take a look at their maps, look for the core habitat, the core wildlands, and set those aside as like a supranational park inside the larger national park, inside the forest system around that national park or that forest, and designate it especially as wilderness. And we're going to keep it wild. So no more visitor centers, no fancy paved trails, no roads, definitely not running electricity or plumbing through there. We need some spaces that we can't civilize and make easy and super soft. We're going to call that our wilderness preservation system. All right, I'm 33 seconds over. We'll stop it there. I'm around for questions, comments, verbal abuse. If you're working with me on your resume, I'm around right after class outside of my office at the conference table over there. Happy to help.